Welcome to the Regional Connector Study virtual public meeting presentation for the Regional Connector Study scenario analysis. The Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization is performing the Regional Connector Study to establish a long-term vision that investigates transportation options that connect the peninsula and the South Side while improving economic vitality, resiliency, accessibility, and quality of life in the region. The study will evaluate harbor crossing alternatives that are not currently funded. This presentation is about an important preparatory step in the study that is designed to test the regional connector alternatives in a way that will increase the region's preparedness through the use of scenarios. In this presentation, we have 4 speakers from the project consultant team. I'm Lorna Parkins with Michael Baker, and we'll also hear from Vlad Gavrilovic with EPRPC, Bill Thomas with Michael Baker, and Naomi Stein with EBP. The Regional Connector Study includes scenarios that represent a range of plausible futures, rather than preparing for only one set of assumptions about the future. Between now and our forecast year of 2045, many things will change in ways that are uncertain. The scenario planning process allows the harbor crossing alternatives to be tested against multiple potential futures in order to be better prepared for what the future may bring. The scenario planning begins by identifying trends that will have a big impact on the region, but that are highly uncertain. These trends include technology advances, for example, connected and autonomous vehicles. These are vehicles that communicate with each other and the surrounding infrastructure, and in the case of autonomous vehicles, there's no driver. New development patterns and live-work-play trends that affect land use are based on changing values, which are also highly uncertain. And we also consider globalization, trade, and shifts in economic sectors that affect freight and commuting travel. By combining different assumptions about these trends, the scenario exercise will create a strong test of resilience for the regional connector alternatives. The scenarios that we developed all represent a future with some additional growth above the currently adopted forecasts of population and employment for 2045. So we call them the greater growth scenarios. And the amount of growth in these 3 scenarios is the same, but each represents a distinctly different set of assumptions. For example, in greater growth on the water, more of the jobs are near the water, but homes are more dispersed throughout the region. And this scenario will help us test more cross-harbor travel. In greater growth in urban centers, there is more of an urban growth pattern for both jobs and housing, and that provides more opportunity for multimodal travel. Greater suburban and greenfield growth has more dispersed growth patterns, both for jobs and housing, in order to test more overall regional travel. We'll address more of the specific drivers of the trends in each scenario later in the presentation. Our scenario modeling process is organized through 3 models that we applied. Starting with the 3 greater growth scenario narratives, we created the virtual futures through the use of a land use model, a travel demand model, and an economic model. In the remainder of the presentation, we're going to step through the key assumptions we made and the results that we produced for the greater growth scenarios from each of these models. These initial scenario results describe this first round of testing using the same existing and funded transportation network in each one. And that allows us to see if we've succeeded in creating alternative, plausible futures. What we're looking for is meaningful differences between the scenarios. We're asking, did we produce different land use, transportation, and economic results that will create a good test of resilience for the regional connector alternatives? We'll begin with the land use model.
Thanks, Lorna. Well, as Lorna said, a big goal for the scenario testing was to achieve meaningful differences between the scenarios. And these maps show how this was done in the land use model. So the suitability maps to the left show how these suitability factors were used to paint a picture of attractiveness to growth under each scenario. Different factors were used and they acted like magnets in the model to pull or attract greater growth allocations of people and jobs to match each scenario narrative. So for example, in the water scenario, proximity to ports and shipbuilding was an important factor. Or in the urban scenario, proximity to high-density employment and transit service were factors. And then on the right, the allocation maps show the outcome of that land use modeling. The computer model allocated that increment of greater growth, people and jobs, according to those suitability maps. And the outputs of this land use modeling were then plugged into the travel demand model to study travel behavior under each of the scenarios. Now the next slide shows the output of the land use modeling. So are there meaningful differences between the scenarios is a key question. And the performance measures for the land use model show some of these important differences in the land use patterns. For example, greater growth in urban places has the most jobs near transit stops or people in multifamily housing, and the greater growth in suburban or greenfield areas has more population growth on undeveloped land, as you might expect. Note that these land use model results are only dealing with the additional growth in the greater growth assumptions. They're not dealing with all the people and jobs in the region as a whole. So some summary conclusions. The distribution of greater growth in each scenario generally match the initial scenario narratives. There's good differentiation between the scenarios, and we achieve this plausible range of alternate futures for the region. So this was a good platform for travel demand model testing and for resilience testing of the transportation alternatives that Bill's going to talk about.
The travel demand model uses data from the land use model, a description of the transportation system, and information describing the adoption and penetration of technology to estimate the amount and patterns of travel in the Hampton Roads region. The travel model operates on all population and employment, not just the greater growth portion. And the technology assumptions affect all trips, not just those generated by greater growth. Next. The goal is translation of the scenario narratives into different levels of technology adoption in order to create differentiation between the scenarios. At two different ends of the spectrum, we have the baseline scenario, where most privately owned and shared vehicles are conventional or not connected and autonomous. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have the suburban scenario, where most privately owned and shared vehicles are autonomous. Next. We examine the regional travel demand estimates of each of the scenarios in terms of how much travel. So in terms of distance or vehicle miles traveled, and in terms of time or vehicle hours traveled, and also in terms of how much delay in hours, which is the amount of additional travel time needed due to congestion. There appears to be a good differentiation of the outcomes between the greater growth scenarios. Differentiation occurs between the scenarios due to differing influences, such as the greater growth, employment, and population added in terms of magnitude and regional distribution, transportation system efficiencies due to technology, and the introduction of more vehicle trips as a consequence of using autonomous vehicles. Next. So we now look at a depiction of change in delay versus the baseline over the regional network for each scenario. Note the geographic and transportation features of the region. So to the north, we have the peninsula. Moving south, the city of Norfolk. To the east, Virginia Beach. And to the west, the jurisdictions of Isle of Wight and Suffolk. The harbor crossings to the east, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. And to the west, the Monitor Merrimack Memorial Bridge Tunnel. And further west, the James River Bridge. So in our legend, we show the percent change in delay versus the baseline, where the warmer colors indicate more congestion and the cooler colors indicate less congestion. So for the greater growth on the water scenario, we can see that with respect to the baseline, there is generally an increase in congestion throughout the region. We see it in the metropolitan areas surrounding Norfolk, in some of the areas in the west of the region, and certainly for some major roadways on the peninsula. Next. For the greater growth in urban center scenario, we see less congestion, thus prevalence of cooler colors on the map. We can see that the peninsula, the major roadways, are much less congested, and there's less congestion in the western portion of the region. Next slide. And finally, our suburban scenario, which is designed to show the most travel and shows the greatest increase of congestion compared to the baseline. Note there is a significant increase in congestion in the western portion of the region and generally over the entire region. Next. So when we compare all three scenarios, we see a good differentiation in terms of the amount and geographic distribution of delay. And these differences are in line with the scenario narratives. And now Naomi will discuss the economic model.
Thanks, Bill. The economic analysis compares the three greater growth scenarios to the 2045 baseline using data that comes from the travel demand model. Characteristics of each scenario, that is growth, technology, land use, all translate into transportation performance changes like those shown in the middle column of this slide. These in turn result in changes in societal costs of travel that capture how easy or efficient travel is across the Hampton Roads region. These costs include things like the money that people pay for gas, how people value spending more or less time getting somewhere, and the cost to society from air pollution or crashes. All the societal costs are monetized in common dollar terms using typical societal benefit valuation factors. This next slide shows the drivers of the economic results and how they change across the four scenarios, which are each represented by a different colored dot. So, for example, on the top row, both the urban and the suburban scenarios have shorter trip lengths because these versions of the future have more mixed-use development patterns. On the second and third rows, you can see that the greater growth in urban centers scenario sees faster speeds and less congestion compared to the baseline. While on the other hand, the other two scenarios are slower in speed and more congested than the baseline. Next, you can see that the suburban growth scenario has a significant drop in vehicle occupancy because there are more autonomous vehicles in this scenario, and sometimes they travel empty or as zero occupancy vehicles between picking people up and dropping them off. Finally, the suburban scenario also has much lower crash rates than the other scenarios because of automation. This reduces human driver error. The urban scenario also has some improvements in safety from connected and autonomous vehicle adoption. And because we assume that autonomous vehicles will also be electric, more of the overall vehicle fleet is electric in the urban and suburban scenarios compared to the baseline or to the greater growth on the water scenario. Next slide. So based on those drivers, this slide summarizes the economic results. In the baseline 2045 scenario, there are overall costs associated with the time and the money that people allot for travel, including movement of goods, along with the annual societal costs of crashes and of emissions. These costs of travel then change as a result of changing transportation conditions in each of the greater growth scenarios. And that change is reflected in the up and down arrows in the coloring on this slide. To start with the water scenario, this scenario sees an overall increase in total societal costs, meaning travel is less efficient because people's travel takes longer, is less reliable, and is less safe. However, you do in this scenario see some minor savings for freight transportation and of emissions. The urban scenario is the only scenario that sees societal costs of travel decrease across the board. Regional travel is faster, less expensive, safer, and less environmentally harmful. Finally, the suburban scenario has a mix of outcomes. While congestion is worse, as you can see from the red arrow, this is counteracted by safer and, quote, greener or more environmentally friendly travel with the widespread adoption of electric, connected, and autonomous vehicles. So in this scenario, overall societal costs do decrease. These results overall show that the four futures are very different from one another and will be a good test of resilience for the connector projects. And now Lorna is going to wrap things up talking about next steps.
Thank you, Naomi. So that does complete our overview of the initial scenario results. When the candidate alternatives for the regional crossings are defined later in the study, they will each be tested with every scenario so that we'll be able to see which alternatives perform the best across all the potential futures. These performance results will provide the basis for prioritizing the regional crossing alternatives. This approach is key to choosing resilient investments and being prepared for a range of possible futures. Thank you for your time and attention, and we hope that you'll explore the project website where you can find even more background information on the study process and scenario planning. We especially would like you to take our survey. The online survey shown on the right is available on our website, and it steps through much of the same information we just presented while offering opportunities for you to provide your comments and input. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. Thank you again for your time, and we hope that you will continue to engage in the Regional Connector study. Thank you.